Perry Farrell admits he was loaded for 40 years, and this confession exposes the darkest secret behind one of rock's most dangerous legends. Perry Farrell stood at the center of alternative rock like a prophet wrapped in chaos, a voice that sounded fearless, theatrical, and untouchable. Yet behind the mystique of Jane's addiction lived a truth far darker than the music ever revealed. A truth Perry himself would later admit with brutal honesty, saying he was loaded for 40 years, not as a passing confession, but as a lifelong shadow that followed every stage light, every scream of the crowd, and every artistic breakthrough that made him legendary. Perry Farrell did not begin as a reckless icon chasing destruction. He began as a dreamer, desperate to escape pain, loss, and instability, shaped by early tragedy and a restless hunger to feel something bigger than fear. And when music finally gave him that feeling, drugs quietly arrived as a companion, first enhancing creativity, then slowly tightening control, disguising dependence as freedom, while the world applauded the madness as genius. Jane's addiction exploded onto the scene sounding dangerous, sexual, and unfiltered, and Perry became the symbol of that rebellion, a frontman who seemed immune to limits. Yet behind closed doors, the same substances that fueled the wild performances were carving deep fractures into his mental health, relationships, and sense of self, creating a cycle where chaos on stage masked collapse off stage. Perry Farrell later admitted that being high felt like survival rather than indulgence, a shield against pressure, trauma, and the unbearable weight of expectation. And for decades, the industry rewarded this behavior, mistaking endurance for strength, while fans romanticized the erotic energy without realizing the toll it extracted from the man behind the microphone. As Jane's addiction grew bigger, so did the dependency, stretching across tours, studio sessions, and years that blurred together. And Perry learned how to function inside intoxication, how to write lyrics, command crowds, and build empires while never truly being present, turning addiction into a routine rather than a crisis, which made it far more dangerous. The band's internal tension often mirrored Perry's internal war, with creative clashes, sudden breakups, and reunions that felt as unstable as the lifestyles fueling them. And while outsiders blamed egos and artistic differences, few understood that substance abuse was quietly amplifying every conflict, distorting perception, and turning minor disagreements into explosive breakdowns. Perry Farrell became both the architect and the casualty of his own mythology, a man praised for living without restraint while privately losing control. And even as success multiplied through festivals, side projects, and cultural influence, the addiction followed faithfully, never asking permission, never giving space, and never loosening its grip. He described decades where sobriety felt unnatural, where clarity felt frightening, and where stopping meant confronting grief, anxiety, and identity without chemical armor, making addiction not just a habit, but a deeply embedded survival mechanism that shaped how he saw the world and himself. Fans saw costumes, rituals, and fearless performances, but they did not see the exhaustion, paranoia, and emotional numbness that accumulated over years of constant use. Nor did they see how the line between art and self-destruction slowly disappeared until Perry could no longer tell where the persona ended and the damage began. By the time Perry Farrell openly acknowledged the depth of his addiction, the admission landed not as shock but as revelation, a missing puzzle piece that suddenly explained decades of instability, brilliance, and near collapse, setting the stage for a reckoning that would redefine both his legacy and his understanding of freedom itself. Reached the moment where silence was no longer possible, where 40 years of chemical escape had finally collided with aging, reflection, and the terrifying realization that survival without intoxication demanded courage he had never practiced before. Sobriety did not arrive as clarity or peace, it arrived as noise, emotion, and memory rushing back without filters, forcing him to sit with grief, anxiety, and identity stripped of every artificial shield he once relied upon throughout his adult life. Perry Farrell admitted that drugs were never just about pleasure. They were armor, protection against childhood loss, artistic pressure, and the impossible expectation to remain endlessly provocative in an industry addicted to novelty. When that armor disappeared, he felt exposed, raw, and emotionally inexperienced, like a man relearning how to exist in his own skin after decades of emotional anesthesia and avoidance. Creativity without intoxication felt frightening at first because addiction had convinced him that chaos was the source of brilliance. Early sobriety challenged that belief brutally, producing doubt, insecurity, and fear that the magic was gone forever. Slowly, however, a different kind of creativity emerged, one rooted in focus, discipline, vulnerability, and emotional honesty rather than excess, confusion, and collapse. Perry Farrell began to recognize how addiction had shaped his relationships, turning love into turbulence and connection into conflict. Accountability replaced denial, and while not every bridge could be rebuilt, sobriety allowed truth to exist where performance once stood. Conversations became clearer, apologies became sincere, and silence no longer needed to be escaped through stimulation. The music industry looked different through sober eyes. Perry saw how self-destruction had been encouraged, normalized, and rewarded as long as productivity continued. He recognized how many artists were celebrated for burning out rather than growing old, and how survival itself was often treated as betrayal of authenticity rather than strength. Fans who followed Perry Farrell's journey witnessed transformation without spectacle. The wild unpredictability softened into grounded presence, proving intensity did not require intoxication. His honesty dismantled romantic myths surrounding addiction, replacing fantasy with lived experience, consequence, accountability, and responsibility without shame. Perry Farrell openly stated that addiction steals time quietly, years disappearing while life feels busy, creative, and full. Only in sobriety did he fully grasp how much had been surrendered to substances masquerading as freedom. This realization reframed his past, not as rebellion, but endurance shaped by unresolved pain and emotional avoidance. Legacy became a different question once survival was no longer guaranteed by youth. Perry began to view his story not as warning or confession, but testimony. He did not erase the music born from chaos, yet refused to glorify the suffering that accompanied it, allowing both truths to exist honestly together. Sobriety required humility, patience, and acceptance that healing was ongoing rather than complete. Perry Farrell acknowledged that recovery did not create perfection, but awareness, and awareness became the foundation for freedom he had chased chemically for decades without finding peace. With clarity came responsibility, to speak openly, not as moral authority but as witness. Perry understood that silence allowed myths to survive, and myths continued to trap others in cycles of self-destruction disguised as artistic necessity. His voice shifted from provocation to honesty, from spectacle to reflection. He described sobriety as learning to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, to feel emotions without distortion, and to accept vulnerability as strength rather than weakness. This process was neither linear nor glamorous, but it was real, demanding daily attention rather than dramatic transformation. Perry Farrell also confronted grief that substances had postponed, mourning lost time, damaged connections, and moments blurred beyond recovery. Instead of collapsing under regret, he reframed grief as motivation to remain present, honoring survival by choosing awareness over numbness each day. Performance changed as well. The stage no longer served as an escape hatch, but as a place of intention. Energy came from presence rather than chemical intensity, proving that authenticity could exist without self-destruction, and that connection with audiences deepened through honesty rather than chaos. The mythology surrounding his past did not disappear, but Perry Farrell learned to coexist with it without being controlled by it. He accepted that history could be acknowledged without repeated, that legend could exist without reenactment, and that growth did not require erasing identity. Today, Perry Farrell stands as proof that transformation is not reinvention, but return. A return to presence, responsibility, emotional literacy, and self-knowledge earned through discomfort. The darkest chapter closed not with denial or tragedy, but with truth, survival, and the courage to finally stay alive. Perry Farrell continues to emphasize that recovery is not a finish line, but a commitment, a daily choice to remain conscious rather than comfortable. He speaks about sobriety as a relationship with reality, one that demands honesty, patience, and accountability even when life becomes overwhelming. Instead of chasing extremes, he values balance, understanding that peace does not eliminate struggle, but changes how struggle is faced. His story resonates because it refuses simple redemption narratives, choosing complexity over fantasy. Perry does not claim victory over addiction, only awareness of its power and the necessity of respect. This perspective removes shame while reinforcing responsibility, offering others permission to seek clarity without self-punishment. Through survival, reflection, and truth, Perry Farrell transformed endurance into wisdom, proving that staying alive, present, and accountable can be the most radical act of all. He reminds audiences that art does not require destruction, and that pain processed honestly becomes insight rather than spectacle. By choosing presence over escape, Perry Farrell reclaimed authorship of his life, refusing to let addiction write the ending. His journey stands as living evidence that awareness can arrive late yet still matter, and that truth, even after decades of silence, remains worth speaking aloud. In choosing clarity, Perry Farrell demonstrated that survival itself can become legacy, teaching that freedom is not found in excess, but in remaining awake, accountable, and human, even when facing uncomfortable truths without protection. Always honest, always present.